In 1988, in a quiet suburb of Johannesburg, a 12-year-old boy named Martin Pistorius began to feel unwell. The symptoms appeared ordinary at first, nothing that would suggest the magnitude of what was to come. He complained of a sore throat, then fatigue, then a heaviness in his limbs that his parents attributed to a common childhood illness. But the heaviness did not lift. Days passed, then weeks, and the boy who had once played sports and attended school with enthusiasm began to withdraw into a silence that felt increasingly profound. His parents watched as their son seemed to fade before their eyes, his body losing its responsiveness, his movements becoming slow and uncertain. Medical consultations yielded no clear diagnosis. The doctors ran tests, searching for infections, for neurological damage, for anything that might explain the rapid deterioration. Nothing conclusive emerged. The illness had no name, no precedent in their experience, only a relentless progression that stripped away function after function. Within months, Martin could no longer walk. His body had become a prison of stillness. He could not feed himself, could not control his movements, could not form words with his mouth. His eyes remained open, but they seemed unfocused, distant, as though the person inside had retreated to some unreachable place. The medical consensus settled on a grim conclusion. The boy had entered a persistent vegetative state. His consciousness, they believed, had been extinguished by whatever force had ravaged his nervous system. There was no reason to expect recovery, no treatment that might reverse what had been done. His parents were told to prepare for a life of permanent care, to accept that their son existed now only in the most minimal biological sense. The boy they had known was gone. The diagnosis carried with it a finality that felt almost like death, except that the body remained, breathing, existing, requiring constant attention. His father, Rodney, and his mother, Joan, were left to navigate a grief that had no clear shape, mourning a child who still lived, but who they believed would never again know them. The years that followed were marked by routine. Martin was moved from bed to wheelchair, bathed, dressed, positioned to prevent bed sores. Care centers became his world, sterile rooms filled with others in similar states of unresponsiveness. Staff members spoke over him, around him, treating his body as an object to be managed rather than a person to be addressed. There was no expectation of awareness, no consideration that anything remained inside. And so conversations happened freely in his presence. Discussions about his condition, about the burden of his care, about frustrations and resentments that would never have been voiced if anyone believed he could hear. The television played endlessly in the background, news programs cycling through wars and elections and cultural shifts. A stream of information, absorbed by a mind that no one suspected was present. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, the end of apartheid, all of these historic moments flickered across screens in rooms where Martin sat, unmoving, supposedly unaware. But Martin was there. Somewhere in the second or third year of his silence, consciousness had returned. Not movement, not speech, not any ability to signal his presence, but thought. Awareness. A sense of self trapped behind eyes that could not focus, inside a body that would not obey. The realization came gradually, a slow emergence from fog into a reality far more terrible than unconsciousness. He could hear the voices of caregivers discussing him as though he were furniture. He could feel the rough handling, the impatience, the occasional cruelty of those who believed no one was watching. He understood the passage of time, the years accumulating, the hopelessness that settled over his family, and he could do nothing. No scream could escape, no finger could twitch, no eye movement could break the pattern of random drift that everyone assumed was meaningless. He was alone in a way that defied description, present but erased, conscious but invisible. The psychological weight of such existence pressed down with suffocating force. There were moments when Martin heard his mother, exhausted and broken by years of caregiving, express a wish that he would die. The words cut through him, but he could not blame her. He understood her desperation. the toll of caring for a son who seemed to offer nothing in return, who drained resources and energy and hope without any sign of recognition or progress. Yet the knowledge that even his own mother had abandoned hope for his personhood added a layer of isolation that went beyond physical paralysis. He was not simply trapped, he was forgotten, even by those who saw him every day. Time stretched in ways that felt unbearable. Hours spent staring at walls, at ceiling tiles, at the same television programs, repeating their cycles of news and entertainment. Days blurred into months, months into years. He tracked the passage of time through external markers, the changing of seasons visible through windows, the aging of familiar voices, the references to years that anchored him to a timeline he could not participate in. The care center where Martin spent much of his time was a place of muted colors and antiseptic smells, corridors that echoed with the sounds of wheelchairs and medical equipment. The staff rotated through shifts with varying degrees of compassion and burnout. Some were gentle, speaking softly even to patients they believed could not hear. Others were perfunctory, efficient but detached, going through motions that had long since lost any emotional resonance. And some were cruel. Martin experienced abuse that he could neither prevent nor report. He was manhandled roughly when being moved, left in uncomfortable positions for hours, sometimes mocked or spoken to with contempt. The helplessness was absolute. Every instinct to resist, to cry out, to defend himself was met with the blank wall of his own paralysis. The body that should have protected him had become the instrument of his torment. The isolation bred a kind of psychological endurance that transformed over time. Martin developed strategies for mental survival. He learned to retreat into his own mind, to construct entire worlds of thought where his body did not matter. He replayed memories from before his illness, walked through his childhood home in his imagination, reconstructed conversations with friends he had not seen in years. He composed stories, invented characters and plots, building narratives that unfolded over days and weeks. He solved mathematical problems, working through equations in his head, with nothing but memory and logic. Anything to maintain a sense of self against the crushing monotony. But there were also moments of despair so profound that they felt like drowning. Moments when the awareness of his own consciousness seemed like a curse, when oblivion would have been mercy. The human mind was not designed for such confinement. Every instinct screamed for movement, for expression, for connection, and every instinct went unanswered. The question of why his consciousness had returned remained unanswered. The initial illness had never been definitively diagnosed. Some doctors speculated it might have been a form of encephalitis, an inflammation of the brain that could cause severe neurological damage. Others considered degenerative conditions, rare infections, autoimmune disorders. But without clear evidence, the cause remained speculative. What was certain was that the damage had been profound and that recovery, in any conventional sense, had seemed impossible. Yet somewhere in the darkness of those first years, neural pathways had reconnected in ways that allowed thought to resume, even as motor control remained absent. Martin became aware without becoming able. It was a partial resurrection, a return to consciousness without the tools to make that consciousness known. By the mid-1990s, Martin had been in this state for nearly 7 years. His teenage years had passed without his participation. He had not experienced adolescence in any normal sense, had not formed friendships or romantic relationships, had not learned to drive or prepare for a future. His body had matured physically, while his social and emotional development remained frozen at age 12, at least from an external perspective. Internally, he had aged in different ways. The years of observation, of listening to adult conversations, of absorbing news and television programming, had given him knowledge and perspectives that were unusual for someone his chronological age. He understood political complexities, social dynamics, the adult world in ways that a typical teenager would not. But he had no way to demonstrate this understanding. To everyone around him, he remained a child, trapped and unchanging. The strain on his family was immense. His father continued working to support the household and the costs of Martin's care. His mother bore the primary burden of daily caregiving when he was at home, a responsibility that consumed her life. She had given up work, social connections, personal aspirations to attend to a son who gave no indication that he recognized her sacrifices. The relationship between his parents became strained under the weight of chronic stress and grief. They loved their son, but the son they loved existed only in memory. The person in the wheelchair before them seemed like an empty vessel, a cruel reminder of what had been lost. And Martin heard and understood all of this. He felt the guilt of being a burden, the pain of causing suffering to people he loved, the frustration of being unable to offer even the smallest gesture of gratitude or affection. There were moments of particular cruelty that Martin would later describe as among the worst of his ordeal. Being left facing a wall for 8 hours because a caregiver forgot to reposition him, listening to staff members discuss their personal lives, their plans for the evening, their complaints about difficult patients, while he sat among them, treated as scenery. Being taken to activities meant for people with severe cognitive disabilities, children's games and simple songs, while his mind craved intellectual stimulation. The dissonance between his internal experience and external treatment created a kind of psychological vertigo, a constant reminder that he existed in two entirely separate realities that never touched. By the late 1990s, Martin had been in this state for over a decade. His body had aged from childhood to young adulthood without his participation. He was in his early 20s, physically an adult but treated as a permanent child, dependent and unaware. The staff at the care center had changed over the years, but the assumptions about him had not. He remained a case without hope, a body to be maintained until death. The routine had become so ingrained that no one questioned it anymore. His existence had been reduced to a schedule: waking, bathing, feeding, positioning, television, sleep, day after day, year after year, with no variation, no progress, no expectation of change. The world outside continued to evolve. Technology advanced, politics shifted, culture transformed, and Martin absorbed it all, a silent witness to a decade of human history, unable to participate, but unable to look away. Then a new caregiver arrived. Her name was Virna van der Walt, and she approached her work with a level of attention that differed from what Martin had experienced before. She spoke to him directly, addressed him as a person, watched his face during conversations. It was not that she believed he was conscious, not initially. It was simply her nature to treat all patients with dignity, to maintain the habit of personhood even in the absence of response. But as weeks passed, she began to notice something. His eyes, which had always seemed to drift randomly, occasionally seemed to track, not consistently, not obviously, but enough to create a question in her mind. When she spoke to him about specific topics, there seemed to be moments where his gaze would shift in ways that felt intentional. She tested her observation carefully, speaking to him and watching for patterns. She moved objects across his field of vision, asked questions and looked for any flicker of response. What she saw was subtle, easy to dismiss as coincidence or wishful thinking. Other staff members, when she mentioned her observations, were skeptical. Martin had been evaluated countless times over the years. Specialists had examined him, tested him, concluded definitively that he was in a persistent vegetative state. The idea that something had been missed for over a decade seemed unlikely to the point of impossibility. But Virna did not dismiss what she had seen. She believed there might be someone inside. The possibility was radical, potentially devastating if she was wrong, raising false hopes in a family that had already endured so much. But she felt a responsibility to pursue it. She advocated for testing, for specialists to reevaluate him with the assumption of potential awareness, rather than certain absence. The process was slow. Skepticism ran deep among medical professionals who had seen too many false hopes in cases like this. Families who insisted they saw recognition in their loved ones, who interpreted random movements as intentional communication, who could not accept the permanence of loss. The medical establishment had learned to be cautious, to rely on objective measures rather than subjective interpretation. But Virna was persistent, and eventually, arrangements were made for augmentative communication assessments. Specialists arrived with equipment designed to detect minimal voluntary control. Technologies that could translate the smallest intentional movement into communication. They worked with Martin over several sessions, testing different modalities, searching for any consistent response that might indicate volition. And when they tested Martin, the impossible became real. He could indicate yes and no. He could answer questions about his name, his age, his family. He could demonstrate memory of events from before his illness and knowledge of events that had occurred during his years of supposed unconsciousness. He knew about current events, recognized politicians and celebrities, could recall conversations he had overheard. The boy who had been written off as vegetative was not only conscious but intellectually intact. He had been present for every moment of his silence. The realization sent shockwaves through everyone who had been involved in his care. Doctors who had examined him years earlier questioned their assessments, wondering what they had missed, what signs might have been present but dismissed. Care center staff who had spoken freely in his presence felt horror at what he must have heard. The casual cruelties and thoughtless comments made in the belief that no one was listening. For Martin's family, the emotions were complex beyond measure. Relief that he was there, that their son had not been lost as completely as they had believed. Horror at what he must have experienced, the loneliness and fear and helplessness of being trapped and unseen. Guilt over words spoken in his presence, over moments of frustration and despair that he had witnessed and understood. Grief for the years lost, the decade of his life that had been stolen not by the illness alone but by the failure to recognize his consciousness. His mother, Joan, struggled particularly with the knowledge that Martin had heard her wish for his death. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary, a reckoning with the reality of what both had endured. Martin expressed understanding, explained that he had never blamed her, that he knew the weight of what she had carried, but the knowledge remained, a wound that time would soften but never fully heal. For Martin himself, the ability to communicate after more than a decade of isolation was overwhelming. The first messages he conveyed were simple affirmations of his presence, answers to questions about his awareness. But as he gained more control over augmentative devices, as the technology improved and his skill in using it developed, he began to express the depth of what he had endured, the loneliness that had felt like suffocation, the fear that he would remain trapped forever, that no one would ever discover he was there, the moments of despair when he had wanted to die but could not even accomplish that, and also the determination that had kept him mentally alive, the stubborn refusal to surrender to oblivion, the belief that somehow, someday, someone would see him. Recovery was not a sudden transformation. Martin's body remained profoundly compromised. Most voluntary motor control was permanently lost. The damage done by the initial illness was irreversible, but with communication came possibility. He could make choices about his care, express preferences about food and positioning and environment. He could participate in his own life in ways that had been impossible for over a decade. Therapists worked with him to develop whatever physical capacity remained, identifying tiny movements that could be refined and used for communication. He learned to use a computer with adaptive equipment, specialized switches that responded to minimal pressure or movement. The process was exhausting. Each word a victory, each sentence a marathon of effort. But he persisted. Education became a focus. He had lost his adolescence and early adulthood to paralysis, but his mind was hungry for engagement, for challenge, for the opportunity to grow beyond the narrow confines of his experience. Through distance learning and adapted curricula, he pursued formal education, working toward qualifications that had seemed impossible years earlier. The process was slow, complicated by his physical limitations and the need for constant adaptation of materials and methods, but progress was steady. He studied computer science, drawn to a field where physical limitations posed fewer barriers, where work existed primarily in the realm of thought and digital creation. In 2003, 15 years after the onset of his illness, Martin enrolled at the University of Hertfordshire in England. The decision to study abroad was both practical and symbolic. Practical because the university offered strong programs in assistive technology and had experience accommodating students with severe disabilities. Symbolic because it represented a complete break from the life of medical care and dependency that had defined his existence for so long. He was not a patient anymore. He was a student. The university provided accommodations for his physical limitations, specialized equipment, and support staff who assisted with note-taking and physical navigation of campus. Classmates and professors saw not a medical case but a peer, someone with skills and knowledge and ambitions. The experience of being treated as a whole person, after so many years of invisibility, was profound. The academic work was challenging but manageable. Martin had spent years as an observer, absorbing information without the ability to test or apply it. Now he could engage actively, ask questions, debate ideas, contribute to discussions through his communication device. His perspective was unusual, shaped by years of silent observation and by the experience of existing at the margins of society. He brought insights to discussions about disability, about consciousness, about the relationship between mind and body that came from lived experience rather than theory. He graduated with honors and began working as a web designer and developer, building websites and applications for clients who valued his technical skills and creative problem-solving. His work was indistinguishable from that of any other professional in the field. The limitations of his body were irrelevant in the digital space he inhabited, but the psychological legacy of his years of silence remained. Martin struggled with trauma that had no clear parallel. He had experienced a form of sensory and social deprivation that few could comprehend. A prolonged erasure of personhood while consciousness remained intact. Post-traumatic stress manifested in ways that were difficult to treat because the trauma itself was so unusual. Nightmares brought him back to the care center, to the feeling of being trapped and voiceless. Anxiety surfaced in situations where he felt unheard or dismissed. Echoes of years when his attempts to communicate went unrecognized. He worked with therapists who helped him process the anger, the grief, the complex feelings toward those who had cared for him without knowing he was there. Some caregivers had been kind within the limits of what they believed his condition allowed. Others had been neglectful or cruel. Sorting through these experiences, assigning responsibility appropriately, forgiving where forgiveness was warranted, and acknowledging harm where it had occurred, was a process that took years. Gradually, he found a way to integrate the experience into a life that moved forward rather than remaining locked in the past. He built relationships, first friendships, and eventually romance. In 2009, he married a woman named Joanna, someone who saw him as a complete person rather than a collection of limitations. The relationship was built on communication, on mutual respect, on a shared understanding that identity existed independent of physical function. They built a life together, adapted to his needs but not defined by them. They traveled, explored new places, created memories that were theirs rather than echoes of trauma. The future, which had seemed non-existent for so long, became real. In 2011, Martin published a memoir titled Ghost Boy. The book detailed his experience with unflinching honesty, describing the years of locked-in awareness, the psychological strategies he had developed for survival, the moments of despair, and the determination that had sustained him. He wrote about the abuse he had suffered, the casual cruelties and deliberate harm inflicted by people who believed he could not feel or remember. He wrote about his mother's exhaustion and his own guilt, about the complexity of loving someone while wishing they would die. He wrote about Virna van der Walt, the caregiver who had seen him when others had not, whose attention and persistence had changed everything. The title captured the essence of his existence during those years: present but unseen, alive but treated as absent, a ghost inhabiting his own body. The memoir found a wide audience, resonating with readers who were struck by the extremity of his ordeal and the resilience he had shown. It also sparked discussions in medical and care communities about the assumptions made regarding consciousness, about the limitations of diagnostic tools, about the importance of treating all patients as though awareness might be present even in the absence of clear evidence. Martin's case contributed to a growing body of research on disorders of consciousness. Advances in neuroimaging had begun to reveal that some patients diagnosed as vegetative showed brain activity consistent with conscious thought when presented with specific tasks or questions. The gap between observed behavior and internal experience was larger than medical science had previously understood. Martin became an advocate for people with severe disabilities, particularly those who could not communicate, insisting on the dignity and potential awareness of every person regardless of observable responsiveness. He gave interviews, participated in conferences, contributed to discussions about care standards and patient rights. His message was consistent. Assume consciousness. Assume personhood. Assume that someone is listening. The cost of being wrong in that assumption was minimal, a slight awkwardness in speaking to someone who might not hear. The cost of being wrong in the opposite direction, of treating a conscious person as an object, was devastating. He had lived that devastation for over a decade, and he would not allow others to endure it without speaking out. The years between 1988 and the late 1990s had been a kind of death without dying, a prolonged absence from the world while remaining physically present. But what followed was a reclamation, not a restoration of what had been lost, because the body remained damaged, the years remained stolen, but the construction of something new, a life built on different terms, defined by what was possible rather than what had been taken away. Martin's life after communication became a testament to the persistence of self, the resilience of consciousness, and the fundamental importance of being seen. The horror of his experience lay not in physical suffering alone, though that had been real and ongoing. It lay in the erasure of his personhood, the assumption that he had ceased to exist as a thinking, feeling being. And the profound lesson of his survival was that consciousness can endure in circumstances that seem to deny its very possibility. He had been buried alive inside his own body, and he had emerged to tell the story. The silence he had inhabited for over a decade was broken, and in its place was a voice that insisted on being heard, a presence that demanded recognition, a person who had been lost and then found, who refused to be invisible ever again.